our last lecture, we examined the events that led up to the American Revolution and to the Declaration of Independence. We saw that George III attempted to establish in his North American colonies an efficient, centralized, modern form of government in place of what he saw as inefficient, archaic, too decentralized colonial legislatures. And the attempt by Parliament to establish clearly their legal right to legislate for Englishmen everywhere. This was a crisis of empire brought on by the great expansion of the British Empire after the French and Indian War in 1763. The Americans saw in this attempt not acts which were to give them fair taxation, but rather as a series of individual incidents testing their willingness to defend their liberty. These were their rights as Englishmen, which they saw as under attack. They viewed George III as a would-be tyrant, just like Julius Caesar or Charles in English history, attempting to create an absolute monarchy, and Parliament simply as his tool. Today, we want to look at the actual Declaration of Independence. Now, the American statesmen who responded to these incidents, who led and increasingly unified and created a consensus among their fellow citizens, were just that, statesmen. They were not politicians. In an earlier lecture on Pericles, we defined a statesman. It is a definition we will use again and again. A statesman must have a bedrock of principles, a moral compass, a vision, and the ability to build a consensus to support that vision. And the men who led the American Revolution had just that bedrock of principles in the concept of liberty. They had a strong moral compass that led them to interpret what we might see as acts of expediency in terms of absolute right and wrong. And they had a vision of their rights as Englishmen translated into a broader, more universal concept of the natural rights of all mankind. And they could build a consensus. The Declaration of Independence is that great document to build a consensus, to justify revolution to the colonists and to the entire world. Now, as late as the fall of 1775, there were still many Americans who were unconvinced that independence had to be declared. True, the king had rejected the olive branch petition sent to him by the Continental Congress. True that the colonies were actually at war with the British king. Nonetheless, must independence be declared? And certainly one American who strongly believed that independence had to be declared was George Washington, for he had the task of waging this war. Now, in the first place, until the Americans declared their independence, they were, in the eyes of British law, in the eyes of the world as a whole, traitors and rebels. This made it very difficult for them to attract foreign allies. The King of France might recognize an independent nation, but to give support to armed rebels who were essentially traitors to their own king, that was a different matter. Secondly, it made it difficult to create a navy. The absolute domination of the sea by Britain was a major factor in the war. George Washington wanted to issue warrants that would allow American private ships to carry out active war. But unless they were acting under an independent flag of an independent nation, they were really pirates. That too made the situation difficult. And third was the practicality. I mean, we are at war. Let that be defined. In January 1776, one of those epoch-making books was written, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Paine was a man who grew up in a situation of poverty in Britain, who came to the New World and tried to make a life for himself, but throughout his career had a deep sympathy for the poor, the underdog. And his book, Common Sense, was a catalyst throughout the colonies. The title, it was published in January 1776, spoke to the direction of Paine's argument. It is just common sense that we declare our independence. But first, if you want to look at it theoretically, he argued, why should we be under a king? Monarchy is the worst form of government ever devised. It is nothing but organized robbery. And of all the kingships in the world, the worst is the British kingship. What is it? They are the descendants of William the Conqueror. Now, how can you take pride in being the descendant of a bastard who, with a bunch of armed banditti, landed on the shores of England and seized the crown? And that is what the British crown has been from its inception, organized robbery and plunder. Secondly, the argument that somehow we owe loyalty to Britain for having taken care of us is nonsense. In the first place, your mother takes care of you and you drink her milk. But does this mean you should never grow up and eat meat? Secondly, Britain would have taken care of the Turks if it meant money in their pocket. So they have only taken care of us because it suited their convenience. No, the sun never shone on a fairer cause than our declaring our independence, of simply recognizing the common sense fact that we are independent and should be independent. And George Washington commented on the change in attitudes brought about by this book. And so as the spring began to turn into the summer, as the Continental Congress reconvened, feelings were running high for a declaration of independence. Perhaps if these statesmen had governed by opinion polls and they had run a poll throughout the United States, they might have come up with figures like 43% in favor, 46% not, several percent undecided. But that's not how they knew a nation was to be created. They led, and the Declaration of Independence was a statement of that leadership. And so it was that on June the 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee presented on behalf of the delegates of Virginia a resolution favoring the independence to the Continental Congress. And on June the 10th, a committee of 5 delegates was appointed by Congress to draft such a Declaration of Independence. John Adams of Massachusetts, a lawyer, Harvard-educated, a man of substance, a man of integrity, a man who, as we saw, would defend a British soldier on charges of murder. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, one of the most brilliant of the founding fathers and one of the greatest of all Americans, a lawyer, well-trained, fiery by temperament, seldom speaking, but a master of the pen. Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, who would be lionized in the intellectual and social circles of France, who had long represented the cause of the colonies at the court of the King of England. Self-taught, a man of vision, scientific genius, and a man of the world, who liked the ladies as well as he did his port. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, another of these who had been born in poverty and was a cobbler by trade, but one of the shrewdest of all the founders, who would make his contribution not only at the Declaration of Independence, but far more importantly at the Constitutional Convention, a gift for compromise. And Robert Livingston of New York, wealthy and patrician. But it was Adams and Jefferson of the 5 who really drafted the Declaration, and the lion's part was turned over to Jefferson by John Adams. And Jefferson, writing on a small portable desk, drafted, redrafted the Declaration of Independence until it was presented on June the 28th in a draft form to Congress, who then went over it word by word, picking and choosing and pulling apart, until finally, on the 4th of July, it was adopted. Now, later historians have tried to question what happened on July the 4th. I think we should be content with the memories of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They both believed that everybody signed it on that day, and if not true, then it is certainly well-founded. What is important is the document itself. The Declaration of Independence, the founding document of our country, taking its place alongside the Constitution and, yes, the Gettysburg Address as one of the 3 fundamental statements of American freedom. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to their separation. A long and powerful sentence. Modern English teacher might break it up into 3 or 4 sentences, but no, it rolls with all the force of Cicero. For the Declaration of Independence has 3 main parts. First, its statement of principles, elevating the struggle of the colonist to universal truth. Secondly, a statement of grievances against King George, which justify their rebellion, their resistance to his tyranny as a fundamental right of mankind. And then third, their Declaration of Independence and their commitment to the cause. This first section, the statement of principles, means that the United States is the only nation in history founded on principles. Other nations like Britain are the product of geography or historical accident. They are bringing together people who think they are of a kindred blood or live in contiguous areas. The United States was in the beginning and has always remained a nation of principles. And anyone who comes here and accepts these principles becomes an American. And those principles were stated by Jefferson, harmonizing, as he said, the sentiments of those who sat in Congress. Those principles are among the noblest in history. When in the course of human events, that is an appeal to history as the great justifier. It looks back to the past and cites as precedents the struggles of men and women for freedom through history. And then it becomes necessary for one people. Right there, the Americans have identified themselves. They are now a separate nation. And the principle of self-determination is invoked. That when a people believes themselves to be one, they have the right to create their own nation. It is a principle enunciated in today's newspapers again and again, whether in the Balkans or in the Middle East. The determination and the right of a people that just believes itself to be one, to be free and independent, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. There, Jefferson has invoked the central principle of America, natural law, and has invoked God. God appears 4 times in the Declaration of Independence, and the law of nature is the law of God. It is that universal law that models itself upon the divine reason. And so, the universal law of all mankind and of the Creator of all mankind, they are the very foundation. And the truths upon which the nation are founded are self-evident. You don't need to argue about them. They are true. They are rooted in the reason of all men and women. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke, his 2 treatises on government, are powerful influences upon Jefferson, as he recognized this great tradition of natural law that we will examine in our next lecture is the powerful influence. But Locke spoke mostly of life, liberty, and property. And sometimes in attempting to diminish the power of Jefferson's words, historians have said that's what he meant, property, life, liberty, and property. Justice Blackstone at Oxford would have agreed with him in 1765. Yes, that is what the law was about, life, liberty, and property. But Jefferson did not write property. He wrote the pursuit of happiness. And that implied a far grander concept than property. The pursuit of happiness is your right and your obligation to live as you should. For true happiness lies in living a moral life. That is the view of natural law. That was the view of Jefferson. And this imposes an obligation to use this freedom for the good of the community. The right to live as you should. And then to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. In other words, the end of government are these great universal blessings of liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness. And that if a government becomes destructive of those forms, it is the right and the necessity of a people to overthrow it. This then invokes, as part of natural law, the right to revolution. And ultimately, that right to revolution rests upon public opinion. It is the public, the people, that ultimately must decide when a government has become so injurious of its natural rights that it must be overthrown. Certainly, human nature is such that people will put up with almost anything, as the colonists have put up year after year with a train of abuses. But when it becomes clear that the government has only one goal, to reduce them to tyranny by its repeated injuries and usurpations, then revolution is the only course. That brings us then to the second part. Jefferson has laid at the beginning, as one should, the broad base of principles. Then he looks at the individual episodes which show that the king has revoked his obligation to support natural law and instead is determined to be a tyrant. Now, this list of grievances is no random list. It is not like a modern attorney throwing everything at somebody to see what will stick. No. It is a very carefully crafted list of grievances, crafted carefully in rhetorical terms. It moves from small incidents to a rising crescendo of indictment against the king. But it also invokes the spirit of John Locke. For Locke, in his two treatises on government, had given 5 criteria which justify revolution. If the government, for example, substitutes arbitrary will for law. 2, if it hinders meetings and actions of the legislature. 3, if it alters the mode of electing the legislature. If the king or government delivers its subjects over to a foreign power. And 5th, if the government abandons its trust to govern for the welfare of its people. These criteria justify revolution. And Jefferson has carefully arranged these incidents, beginning with the king has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He, the king. Now, the quarrel was with Parliament as much as with the king. But for 2 reasons, Jefferson and the statesmen who adopt this declaration focus on the king. One is simply rhetorical. It is far better to demonize one person than an entire group. Makes it far more effective and far more focused. But secondly, the colonists believe that Parliament has never had jurisdiction over them. So they're not declaring their independence from a Parliament to which they have never been bound. Their independence is declared from the king, who is the only legal sovereign of the American colonies. But the king has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Well, King George would say, I have the veto power. I am supposed to use my veto. But he has vetoed good laws, such as laws about the slave trade or laws about lotteries. Law of Virginia wanted to limit the importation of slaves, and this was vetoed by the king. Well, the colonists now are assuming to themselves the right to say when the king can veto. So you see, the people have the right of moral judgment, even if the king has the legal authority to veto. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation, till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. Well, yes. Indeed, the king has the right, when a law is sent to him by one of the colonial legislatures, just not to act upon it, what we would call a pocket veto, just to sit upon it. One such law, North Carolina, had been sitting there since 1754. But that, again, is the legal prerogative of the king. But in the terms of John Locke, by such actions, he is substituting arbitrary will for law. He is arbitrarily vetoing even good laws. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right of the greatest importance to them and formidable only to tyrants. Now, true, when districts on the frontier of Virginia wanted to be settled, they wanted representation in the legislature. But the king thought it better that they surrender this right. How could they really be represented in such a distant place? And so in order to be organized into counties, they had to waive the right to be represented. But who but a tyrant would want to deny people to be represented? It's just like the law forbidding the Americans to settle west of the Alleghenies. The king obviously doesn't want the rugged frontier liberty that these men and women bring with them. So now he has gone beyond arbitrary will. He is now interfering with the very character of the legislature. And he has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their records. Yes, 1768, a smallpox outbreak in Boston led the legislature of Massachusetts to be in Cambridge for several years. And it was kept there, originally out of protection against the plague, but then simply kept there. Now, the king's governor agreed that the legislature could move back to Boston, but only if they agreed that it was the king's prerogative to say where they met. So now the king is again interfering with the election of the legislature and hindering meetings and actions of the legislature. And then he has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent for laws establishing judiciary powers. For years, North Carolina had not even had a Supreme Court because the king would not give his permission through the governor for its reorganization. So he's continuing to substitute his arbitrary will. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Well, these were the new officials created for the custom duties collections. But now he is beginning to violate his trust by destroying the rights of his people with these new officers. And then he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, imposing taxes on us without our consent. Who is this foreign body to whom the colonists have been subjected? It is Parliament. This is the statement that Parliament has no jurisdiction over the colonies and hence fulfills the fourth of Locke's criteria. He has given his people over to a foreign power. And then, the list goes greater. He has abdicated our government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. And now our crescendo is being reached, and the fifth of Locke's criteria is fulfilled. For the king has abandoned his trust to govern his people, and in fact has declared them out of his protection. So skillfully, rhetorically, philosophically, the case for revolution and independence has been placed before a candid world. Now, each of these grievances reflect traditional rights of Englishmen. But Jefferson has taken these traditional rights, these individual incidents, and made them usurpations of natural law. And the Americans are but stating the right of all mankind, laying their foundation on the broadest possible base. And then, we have at every stage of these oppressions petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked out by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. This word tyrant is no rhetorical flourish. To the 18th century, steeped in the classics, tyranny was a concrete reality. It was the other side of liberty. It was exactly by such a set of carefully increasing usurpations of power that Julius Caesar of Rome or Pisistratus of Athens had laid the foundation for their despotism. And tyranny was an institution that destroyed every moral fiber of the people. The tyrant corrupted, the tyrant destroyed commerce, and brought devastation in his wake. And that is the goal of George III. We have tried to appeal to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature, their parliament, to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of our circumstances of our emigration and settlement. We came out here as free Englishmen to govern ourselves, and we have appealed to their native justice, and we have conjured them by ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations. And they too have been deaf to our pleas. And so, we must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war and in peace, friends. Therefore, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, declare our independence. Once again, the very end, as at the beginning, God is invoked. He is the supreme judge, the author of natural law. And we solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states. We might pause just for a second and note the grammar. They are free and independent states, 13 free and independent states, uniting for this common action. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. In his Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln would go back to the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution, as the foundation of our country. He would call for a new birth of freedom under God, invoking, just as the statesman, the Declaration of Independence, divine providence as the source for their strength and justice. And then we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The typical rhetorical ending of three elements, but lifted in magnitude. Our lives. Yes, our lives are important. They are an unalienable right. Our fortunes. Yes. Many of us are wealthy, and some of us will end up bankrupt as a result of supporting this cause. But what is most critical is our honor. That alone has the adjective, our sacred honor. And their honor, their moral obligation to the truth and to justice, that is the ultimate guarantee for this great document and its declaration of principles for a new nation. To its foundation in natural law, return in our next lecture.